Graffiti. You can't read it, you can't do it, legally, and if you're like me, you might not really get the purpose of it, but it's everywhere. If you travel anywhere in the US, you'll find it on bridges, buildings, roads, signs, and all sorts of places. If you go abroad, you'll find graffiti in most cities and countries, regardless of language or culture. And while the styles of graffiti may differ from place to place, most of it looks surprisingly similar to the graffiti back at home. So welcome to Desert Docks. Today I'm going to venture into the origins of graffiti, introduce you to the godfather of graffiti, and attempt to explain why it's such a universal form of art. It's a wild story, so stick with me. I'll start off with history, beginning with the word itself. It's kind of a weird word, actually. When I was a kid, I thought it was pronounced graffiti, but that's not the case. It's graffiti, and it originates from the Italian word graffito, which means something scratched. Apparently, archaeologists in the 1850s used the word to describe scratched inscriptions found at ancient archaeological sites. And that's basically where graffiti got its start. Ancient people were drawing on cave walls thousands of years ago, and after that, the ancient Greeks and Romans carved their names into the sides of buildings, along with protest poems, which is an impressively educated way to voice your random opinions. Next time you want to vent about a political candidate through graffiti, try a protest poem. Fast forward a bit to the Civil War, when American soldiers were known to carve names and pictures on buildings, homes, churches, you name it. According to the New York Times, the messages left behind ranged anything from ordinary comments like, "The 91st Ohio got dinner on the opposite side of the creek today," to curses and trash talk directed at adversaries, including one creative note left for the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, requesting that he be eaten by a shark, that will then be eaten by a whale, that will then go to hell. Since many towns in Northern Virginia changed hands many times, soldiers had the chance to respond to graffiti left on walls by their adversaries. Some of this trash talk is still preserved in historic homes today. So next time your buddy claims to have invented trash talk, make sure you put him in his place. In World War I, the walls of below-ground tunnels that housed thousands of American soldiers became decorated with countless names and drawings. And during World War II, the graffiti trend continued, and it wasn't just limited to the Americans either. Soldiers of all backgrounds were known to leave behind messages in barracks and buildings. Maybe one of the most popular forms of graffiti during this time period, and my personal favorite, was the invention of the famous tagline, "Kilroy was here," which could be found nearly everywhere soldiers went. Allegedly, even the bathroom that Stalin used during the 1945 Potsdam Conference was marked with the slogan, causing Stalin to angrily demand an explanation for who Kilroy was. As for the rest of us, we'll probably never know either. Evidence of war graffiti can be found all over the world, which makes sense. After all, being involved in a conflict likely taps into the most basic human need to be remembered. Modern graffiti, however, is largely traced back to the godfather of graffiti, a kid who lived in Philadelphia in the 1960s. His name is Daryl McCrae, and he basically invented the urban graffiti that we know today. At the age of 12, he was sent to a juvenile correction facility, where he complained that the cook only baked white bread and not the cornbread that Daryl ate at home. The cook began calling him cornbread, and the name stuck. The correctional facility was filled with other Philadelphia gang members, who would often scrawl their names on the walls in the facility. Cornbread started to write his new nickname on the walls with the other kids. This was technically his earliest start in graffiti. After getting out of juvie, Cornbread fell in love with a girl named Cynthia. Supposedly, he began writing "Cornbread loves Cynthia" on the local buildings, and after winning her over, he continued to leave his tagline all over Philadelphia. Cornbread was quite the character. Upon further research, I discovered that in 1971, a gang member named Cornelius Hosey was shot and killed, and the newspapers accidentally identified him as Cornbread. Because of this, Cornbread wanted to make a big entrance back into the public eye, proclaiming that he was still alive, I guess. So he covered the entire Philadelphia Zoo with his tagline and wrote "Cornbread lives" on an elephant that, according to this Wikipedia page, he had met a few days prior. I don't really know what that means, if he knew this elephant personally or what, but there you go. Afterwards, he was arrested and had to serve community service. There was a documentary made about him in 2007 called The Legend of Cornbread, which I think is a pretty epic title for any documentary, and I might actually have to watch that. And nowadays, he's a public speaker who motivates youth to avoid getting into trouble with the law, which is pretty cool for him. So Cornbread pretty much invented modern graffiti, although various groups were experimenting with the concept around the same time. While Cornbread was leaving his message all over Philadelphia, the graffiti movement was starting in New York. And, across the world, the construction of the Berlin Wall in Germany launched public efforts of self-expression through graffiti. In fact, the Berlin Wall is one of the most influential moments in history for the worldwide adoption of graffiti. Frequent press coverage of the Berlin Wall introduced much of the world to the political art that covered it, and during the Cold War, this interest in street art only grew. Much of the graffiti during this time period showed the restlessness of a generation on the brink of war. By the early 70s, graffiti had caught on in New York especially, as street gangs were covering their territories with tags and letters all throughout the city. Subway windows became so cluttered with paint that it was hard to see out of them. Graffiti became more and more of a problem for urban authorities, and in the 1980s, the law began cracking down on graffiti artists. But street art remained popular in spite of the risk, and maybe even because of the risk. In the late 80s and 90s, artists like Banksy became known around the world for their works of art on the streets, which went past traditional taglines and were more intended as political or humorous commentary. Modern graffiti, at this point, was on track to spread throughout the world. Artists were traveling to New York to experience the scene firsthand, which led to the adoption and adaptation of graffiti in other major cities like Paris, London, and Berlin. The worldwide fascination with popular artists like Banksy only fueled the fire, but it was the invention of the internet that truly allowed graffiti to take off. It enabled artists to share their work around the world in an instant, and united the graffiti community across the globe. The internet is probably the biggest factor of why graffiti is so universal and so recognizable as a method of expression, but it's not the only factor. Especially in specific cities, many local artists learn from each other, which results in similar styles that can span generations. Plus, common forms of graffiti are often linked to practicality. After all, most graffiti artists use the same tool, the humble can of spray paint. Large fonts and curved letters are important from a style perspective, but they also allow the artist to create quickly and avoid getting caught. That being said, as common as graffiti has become, it's also evolved into many different forms around the world, and the scrawled, blocked, or stenciled taglines that you've come to see everywhere can be found next to new styles that you've never seen anywhere else. Nowadays, graffiti is recognized as both a crime and an art form, and there are valid arguments for both sides. Some cities have legal walls where artists can create their art, and graffiti festivals, like the Meeting of Styles in Germany, provide platforms for artists to showcase their work. On the other hand, the battle to win back the streets from local gang taglines is an ongoing fight for authorities. And while all the historical factors contribute to graffiti becoming such a universal art form, I think that its widespread popularity is because of something much more than historical events. Graffiti has become a representation of the human need to express ourselves, communicate across borders and barriers, and leave a mark for future generations to find. And while some people abuse it as a form of control or territorialism, it also serves a unique purpose to those who are simply looking to create art worth looking at. That being said, please don't do anything illegal. Thanks for watching.